Do you have any questions up to this point?
No, please.
Okay. We'll move on to look at some tips and strategies that you need to have and master before and during the test to be able to get a very good band score. And you need about 30, 31, 32 correct answers to be able to get a band 7 to join the UK NMC. Once it's a listening test, you have to listen. You'll be multitasking on the day, but then your primary task, your primary focus is to listen. Listen to the recordings, because there's no point just reading the questions and writing when you cannot have access to the information that would enable you to answer the questions. For that reason, although you're multitasking, make sure that a greater part of your senses are listening to the recordings that are being played to be able to find the information to answer the questions. And you need to do purposeful listening. You're not just listening to enjoy the recordings, to enjoy the conversations or the lecture that you're listening to. You are listening to answer 40 questions. And so at some point, you need to know exactly what you have to listen for. And that will be based on what the questions are asking you to listen for. Read the questions, and time is always allocated for that. You're given time to read the questions before you get to hear the recordings. At this point, you need to be able to read all the questions that you've been asked to read. Although it's very unlikely that you remember all the questions that you've been asked to read, you still need to read them and try to concentrate on 2 at a time. Know what question 1 and 2 requires of you offhand. Know that for question 1, I need to look out for this. For question 2, I need to listen for this. Know these 2 so that at some point you can follow the train of information that you're receiving. Once you hear the answer to question 1, it means you should move on to 2 and 3. You hear the answer to question 2, it means you should move on to 3 and 4 in that order till you finish the 40 questions. This is to help you to know whether you have missed the answer to a particular question or not. Because if at some point you hear the answer to question 3 without getting that of question 2, then you know that I have missed the answer to question 2. And so I should do something about that, or I should move on to the other bit of it. You need to be mindful of spelling. Once your spelling is wrong, your answer is wrong. It doesn't matter whether you're having American English spelling or you're having the British version. It should be one of them, and it should be correctly spelled. Otherwise, your answer is just wrong. Then at some point, you would have to do the grammar analysis to know whether your answer is right or not. What I mean by that is that at some point, especially for phrase or sentence completion questions or gap filling questions, once you realize that the word or the words that you have put into the gap, they do not, or it doesn't fit in grammatically, then you should know that there's a problem with that answer that you have. And so either the word or the form of the word is wrong. Probably you need a plural form to make it grammatically right, or you need an entirely different word to make the answer right. You check that to know how right your answer is before you move on to other questions. Then you need to answer as you listen. I mentioned that at some point at the beginning, that because you get to hear the recordings just once, you need to write down your answers on the question paper while you listen to the recordings. And you should train yourself to multitask. You are listening to recordings, at the same time you are reading questions, at the same time you are also writing down answers. You should be able to train yourself to do all these three things and do them aright so that you can find the answers to the 40 questions that you have. Under no circumstance should you tackle a set of questions without reading the instructions. You need to know what you are required to do, especially when it comes to word count. Most of the questions would have an instruction specifying the number of words that you're required to write. In one word only, it means that you cannot write anything but just a word. In no more than 2 words and or a number, you can write 1 word, you can write 2 words, you can write 2 words and a number, and you cannot exceed that. If it says in no more than 3 words and or a number, it means that you cannot exceed that word limit. You can only be equal or you can go less. You cannot exceed that. If it tells you to write A, B, C, D, and you go writing the words that correspond with these letters, it means that your answer is wrong. So you read the instructions before you tackle any set of questions. And you shouldn't be too quick to write down your answers because at some point there may be changes in information. For example, 2 friends may be discussing about going to the movie. They initially agree on meeting at 6 p.m. Then just before they change the subject, one indicates that he or she cannot be available at 6, and so they should move it to 6:30. And they both agree that, okay, we are doing 6:30. If the question is asking you for the time of meeting, it is no longer 6, but 6:30 because there's been a change in information. So at some point, you shouldn't be too quick because once you quickly write down the answers, you move on to the other questions and you may not be fast enough to indicate or to recognize that there's been a change and so I should change my answer accordingly. Listen to the listen to the endings of words and of numbers. Sometimes it's not too clear when you are dealing with plural forms of verbs or plural forms of words. The examiners are very much aware of this particular situation, and so sometimes they would bring some of these things to know whether you're truly proficient in the language or not. For example, if I say task, and I say task, it's not too clear whether I even said the plural form of the word or I said the singular form at some point. And so you should be able to listen to the endings. And this is where grammar becomes important, so that if you read the sentence or the phrase and you are sure that is a plural form of the word that fits in grammatically, then you have to go with the plural form. If both fit in grammatically, then you may so decide to choose either of them, not both of them. Don't write this / that, just settle on one and write that. Sometimes also when it comes to numbers, you're not too sure whether you're hearing 15 or 50, 16 or 60, and so on and so forth. So you need to be able to get and identify the endings of the words before you can get your answers right. I talked about focusing on 2 questions at a time after reading the set of questions that you're required to read at some point. If for whatever reason you so miss the answer to a particular question, make sure that you move on. Do not dwell on the missed answer. Because if you dwell on that, just like a broken heart, you are likely to not move on in life. You're likely to get stuck and all of that. So you make sure that at some point, if you realize you have missed the answer to a particular question, just move on to the other ones. And you'll be able to tell whether you've missed an answer if you focus on 2 questions at a time. And that leads us to the next point that says you shouldn't leave any blanks at all. Even when you miss the answer, just guess, just predict and write something down. If your guess is right, that is all the better for you, because you add 1 more point to boost your band score. Because one mark can make a difference. It can move you from 6.5 to 7. The same way it can move you from 7.0 to 6.5. So every correct answer counts. Every answer that you write counts. So if you guess and it's right, all the better. If you guess and it's not right, it's also not bad, because when it comes to the transfer time, if you're not too careful and you're unable to tell that I didn't write an answer for this particular question, you begin to shift the answers up one after the other. Time may not be on your side to correct that mistake, and it may cost you a lot. Take note of repeated information and stressed and emphasized words. Once you keep practicing, you realize that most or all of the answers to the questions are stressed. There's a little bit of emphasis on these words. You'll be able to identify them when you practice a lot and you get used to the listening test and its format. So at some point, these should help you take note of the answers to the questions that you have. Although the answers to the questions are not very long, the maximum you may have would be 3 words and a number. Sometimes the letters involved in these words are many, and so the word is a bit long or lengthy. So you need to be able to practice shorthand. And it should be something that you'll be able to recognize when it comes to the transfer time. The shorthand should just be for the sake of writing your answers on the question paper, not for the sake of transferring or not for your answer sheet, because remember I told you that spelling matters. So you write in shorthand on your question paper. It should be something that you can easily recognize, so that when it comes to the transfer time, you're not just wondering what it is that I wanted to write when I was writing this particular thing. Otherwise, you'd be very hot. And try as much as possible to write all of your answers in capital letters. This recommendation is for you to keep it on a safer side, because if the word is supposed to be a proper noun, for example, an address, or the name of a place, or the name of a person, and you so begin this with a lowercase letter, your answer is wrong. So begin everything, either you are doing initial capital letters for everything, or you are doing all capital letters. And I prefer the all capital letters because it's clearer. Whatever you write is legible when you're writing in capital letters. For some of us, our handwriting is not too good, and so we don't want to risk it at all. So you write all caps, or you do initial caps for proper nouns, you do lowercase initials for common nouns, or any other suitable way that would help you to get your answers right. Context is very important when you're doing the listening test. And this should help you to predict some of the answers. You're not predicting the exact answer per se, but you're predicting what the answer is likely to be based on the context based on the subject matter of discussion. For example, if you're talking about, let's say, aquaculture, you're likely to hear certain words, so that at some point, when you're not too sure of even what you have heard, you know that once it's related to this subject, then it should be this word and not this other word. Context is very important, and it helps you to predict some of the answers even when you miss them. Practice, they say, makes perfect, and it is very true for IELTS. You should be able to practice. For most students that I have encountered, their first listening test, they get, the person who does very well gets around 20, 23. But with time, with a lot of practice, you see this person getting 33, 34. Some even get as high as 39, 40, over 40. So practicing is very essential when you're doing the listening. The more you practice, the better it becomes for you when you are answering listening test questions.